hi. Happy New Year and welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. My name is Gabe Ignetti. I am the head of the Ecomodernist Society of North America and your host today. And we have decided that there would be nothing better to end this year and start the new one than to give you a compilation of our best work with many distinguished authors and academics that have occurred over the year in short clips, which I know you'll enjoy. And I would just like to say before beginning that it's very worthwhile to watch the whole videos. Let us begin.
NASA's science program, for the most part today, remains purpose-driven. They didn't send the rovers to Mars in order to give money to the airbag industry. So those are purpose-driven programs. And when they do them, despite all the other inefficiencies that get involved with government programs and bureaucracies and so forth, they can do amazing things, and they have. On the other hand, some other programs, including, for instance, the current Artemis program, is being run as a vendor-driven program. They're throwing money around all over the place in order to make a lot of people happy and create a constituency for themselves.
But how about the problem of Mars being 1/3 the gravity of Earth? Might it be a showstopper? Might we end up finding out that it's, we're just not built for that planet because of the low gravity, and that therefore we cannot really have a sustained existence on Mars?
Well, that's conceivable. I can't tell you just sitting here right now that you're wrong. That's not true because we haven't done the experiment. But I don't think it's true. And I did once ask Buzz Aldrin, who, of course, had been both in Earth gravity and zero gravity and lunar gravity, when he was on the moon in 1/6 gravity, which is about 40% that of Mars, did it seem more like Earth or like zero gravity? So, it was much more like Earth. And your whole orientation becomes normal. The fluids in your head that, you have in zero gravity, fluids from your legs go into your head, and that's why astronauts' faces look fat and everything. And they have all kinds of upsets in their various endocrine systems and stuff like this, because all sorts of things are misfiring. That all goes away. You get normal gravity. There's an up, there's a down. You can put the coffee cup on the table. The fluid stays in it. You can cook the way you cook on Earth, which you cannot do in zero G. And you get some workout walking around, and as opposed to just kind of floating from here to there. So I think that people can adapt.
Material science in zero gravity? Is this developing stuff in space? How does the possibility of ultra pure crystal growth in zero G play into what you're doing?
There's some really interesting stuff that might come of it. Let me give one example. I am sharing a structure called a perovskite. This is one of the avenues that zero gravity research could have a big impact on. Now, this is merely a cartoon, but it does effectively represent what the crystallographic unit cell looks like. Right now, there's upwards of 24% performance in photovoltaic cells, so solar panels, but not using the classic traditional silicon, right, SiO2. They're looking at these types of things. They're comprised of different elements. Here, one of the most promising versions, which could be grown in zero gravity, which is super exciting because there's a whole field of crystals that can't be grown on Earth because it's so challenging in our Earth's gravitational field to be able to try and grow these crystals. But in zero or microgravity, you can. Now, perovskites can easily be grown here on Earth. But what they're finding difficulty in is long-term performance. And so absent any gravitational field, one area of promising research is to grow these in zero gravity or microgravity and try to see what their performance is as photovoltaic cells. So that's exciting. And One other interesting aspect, which is not receiving much money, in my personal opinion, research money, as it should, is aluminum alloy research. Aluminum is great. As you can see in the graphic here, it's 1,000 times more abundant on the Earth's surface than copper. The downside, however, is that copper is much more conductive, right? So the resistance on aluminum is far higher. There are a couple other properties about aluminum that make it inferior, unfortunately, a level of conductivity, and aluminum falls by the wayside somewhat quickly. So while aluminum can be used, you have to take some special precautions, usually dielectric fluids and this kind of thing, to stave off oxidation and to keep it cooler so that it maintains a specific thermal window whereby it can be a very good performer. I can't emphasize this enough. There's not nearly enough research going toward making superior aluminum alloys that can get to 80, maybe 90, even 95% of the conductivity of copper, and do so over a much broader temperature range. Those are the two sticky points, right? You want better conductivity, so you want lower resistivity, and you want it over a greater temperature range. So aluminum is a great idea. This is something else that could potentially be done in space, because all metals are crystals. They're easily deformable, but they are nevertheless crystals. And so if you start thinking about that in terms of crystallinity of a metal, then you can start thinking about ways to improve, like I said, the conductivity, in other words, lower the resistivity and open that thermal window. And so those are two areas where I think some great research could occur in microgravity. As a chemist, having read the 2-volume set that Oak Ridge National Laboratories produced roughly from between 1974 and 1976, it was really, as a working chemist like myself, a roadmap, right? I mean, they really solved roughly 97, 98% of all of the problems that they had encountered over the roughly 30-ish year window of research beginning in 1948 with Glenn Seaborg, et cetera, et cetera. I've made small changes, small improvements with the advent of computers that I think are going to bring us over the finish line. Make these improvements in material science cheap and make them profitable, derivatively profitable. And so that's exactly where I am. I'm very, very deep in the material science right now to make the MSR. And as a fluoride salt chemist, which is what my entire PhD and even my postdoctoral fellowship was about, it really, really highly focused on that. So let me give you one example. In discussions with my scientific team, I wanted to address for example, the problem of helium embrittlement. This was a problem, not to get too techie, but this was a big problem back in the 50s and 60s, and they didn't know how to solve it. I believe I've been able to solve it, and I can eliminate the problem through proprietary chemistry to the tune of only around 64 Celsius. So I can make the materials at very low cost because it's low temperature. So you do it cheap, and during your process, whatever products come off, go sell them.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm very interested in as both a chemist and somebody who wants to get 3D printed MSRs out there on every street corner is the DRX method. Initially, the Swedes did some excellent work on direct reduction of iron, so DRI, whereby you just in time produce hydrogen gas. You don't liquefy it, you don't store it, you produce it just in time, liters per minute or liters per second, and you apply it under relatively low heat. So you're going to be using the MSR to do two things. One will be generating the electricity to electrolytically split water, but the other one is to provide enough process heat to, as the Swedish did, because they did decades of research on this, to reduce the iron oxide and reduce it to iron metal, where the only other product that you get is water. Well, I started looking into this. You can do this with many metals in their parent oxide form right out of the ground. Titanium, nickel. You can even do it with thorium, copper, aluminum. It's really versatile. It's low energy, and you're using hydrogen, and then you're producing crystal clear water as the only other reagent. But you're going to simultaneously attack the most energy intensive fields that humanity has in front of us that consume huge amounts of energy and therefore produce huge amounts of carbon dioxide, which is a disaster. But we need it, right? We need it for the metals in the aluminum can. We need it for the titanium that I have in my glasses. We need these things as modern society. What better way to lower our carbon footprint? Thank goodness that we have Oak Ridge National Laboratory scientists for 30 years to basically give us a roadmap. And with the modern advantages that they really never had of high-speed computers, which are cheap, the proprietary chemistries that I've come up with rely on fast computation in order to do the chemistry that I need to do. So shout out to one of my followers on Twitter, a guy by the name of Conrad. He has done a masterful job at downloading commercially available satellite imagery and has put together basically a GIFmation of the construction progress of the Chinese molten salt reactor project over a span of quite a few months. When Xi Jinping wrote a check for $5 billion, that was, by the way, just a teaser. Okay, he's since committed another $3 billion toward that project. It's in the Gobi Desert right now. Our preliminary data demonstrates that we can 3D print our MSR design, which we, by the way, slavishly plagiarize from Oak Ridge. There's no shortage of outstanding designs, right? Mm-hmm. There's a shortage of critical material science innovation and invention out there to make those excellent designs. Our design is an Oak Ridge National Laboratory's design from 1959. And I've already done some preliminary experiments on isotopic depletion, getting the isotopes out of the materials that would hinder performance in the long run, that will improve performance and lower the cost. So, for example, we're ballparking the actual 3D printing is only going to be about $700,000 to $800,000 for an actual unit, for an actual MSR. It's small, it's super tiny. It's not going to be more than about 1.8 meters tall. It can vary between 5 and 30 megawatt electric. Now, that's very small. I think that's business calculus that people can get their heads around.
This is a new book.
Yes.
Earth is a Nuclear Planet? That's the book?
Earth is a Nuclear Planet, yes. And it is super exciting. I'm the senior scientific editor. We spent a lot of time going over these. It's got, almost 1,000 footnotes. It's massively well researched. We talk about ocean harvesting of uranium. Why is Japan leading the way? I mean, leading the way with their now famous polyamide oxime nets that they want to cast into the ocean, and it's specifically tuned to getting the soluble uranium out of the ocean.
In Earth is a Nuclear Planet is that an American has a better chance of being shot by their own dog than being harmed by nuclear power. And the number of fatalities of American nuclear power is 16 in 70 years of commercial nuclear power, and 10 of which are non-radiation related. Because Jacobson, and this is a direct quote from his paper, his roadmap plan, quote, assumes perfect transmission, end quote, right? There was with a solar farm that just got wiped out about a week ago in Missouri or someplace with a hailstorm. He's presuming that all the hydropower dams in the country go, oh yeah, sure, you need energy. We'll just open the taps and flood everybody downstream. And there goes that guy's crop. And there goes that guy's resort because you need energy. It's an incredibly offensively presumptuous and deceptive statement that he has 13 days of backup. There's two sets of numbers that we imported into his package. One is he did not include operation and maintenance for his lithium batteries. And he has 15 terawatts of lithium batteries. I mean, it's just like this, oh my God, you know. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing we imported that they go into was you're going to build 100% renewable grid by 2050. This is how much transmission you're going to need. We imported the transmission estimate by Princeton's study of Net Zero America, which we thought was very thorough. So we added 3.2 trillion to his plan. Mm-hmm. Even if you take that out, if you disagree with us, his plan is still about 20%, 15% more expensive than ours. And so 80-year grid, as he designed it, is like about 39 trillion. And an 80-year nuclear grid that will deliver the same power on a postage stamp of land and a minuscule pile of waste would be, I think, 27 or 8 trillion. So it's about 10 trillion cheaper. Vermont Yankee was not shut down because of the tritium water, but it was a big protesting point that swayed the community. A person would have to drink 3 gallons of the tritiated water that leaked out of Vermont Yankee every day of their life to match the radiation that is already in that person's body as a result of the potassium that you store as a normal part of your diet. The total recorded verifiable deaths from Chernobyl is about 60, not 1 million. One interesting thing is that the 300,000 liquidators are the people that went in briefly and spent 90 seconds of their life removing a piece of nasty stuff, and then they got retired. They, as a population group, have a 15 to 30% lower cancer rate than the general population. Fukushima was built in the country that coined the word tsunami. They put their backup generators in a basement on the beach.
As a cost-saving measure.
As a cost-saving measure, right. Yeah. And I think that environmentalists have to wake up to some hard, cold facts. It's going to for the lifestyle that this planet has just today. You know, with billions of people in poverty and a couple lucky people like me being able to have computers and cars, we're going to need about 20 terawatts of power. It's not even math, it's arithmetic, you know, and we have to get that from somewhere.
But what about the degrowth? What about like just going back to nature?
It's a juvenile fantasy to think that we can degrowth. A happy medieval scenario of the cheery Christmas hearth, that was a fortune in wood for that one evening of camaraderie and celebration. That was a feast of energy to have a cheery, warm Christmas hearth. That's how scarce wood was. That's how scarce energy was.
What we're speaking today about is about his new book, The Case for...
If we were to increase human CO2 emissions 5 times, which we would need to do if we were to remain dependent upon fossil fuels and wish to end poverty, that would then become serious, because now we're not talking about 400 parts per million, we're talking about 1,500 parts per million or more. I think this program is going to be carried out, whether anyone wants to or not, because people don't want to be poor. If we're faced with climate change, that we're going to go to power sources which are dependent on the weather is ridiculous. The windmills kill billions of birds, and also apparently...
How many, did you say billions of birds?
Billions of birds.
Billions of birds, wow.
Yes. And I have the data in the book. If you have a kilogram of uranium and a kilogram of lithium ion battery, you would have to recharge and discharge that battery something like 30 million times in order to have it produce enough energy as the kilogram of uranium. This would take hundreds of thousands of years if you did it every day. And of course, the energy is not actually coming from the battery. It would have to come from something else putting it into the battery. So, and of course, no battery would last 30 million discharges. My PhD is in nuclear engineering, and I worked a bit in the field. And early on, and in the 80s, okay, I was working for the Washington State Office of Radiation Protection, and we had some regulatory authority concerning a Trojan plant, which was...
You were in the belly of the beast, so in other words.
Yeah, just across the border.
Okay.
Well, now here's the thing. The Trojan plant was a very good plant. It was producing electricity at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, fully competitive with the Pacific Northwest very cheap hydroelectric power. And it's a great plant. But it had a problem, which was it had corrosion in the secondary loop, the steam loop. And the utility knew what the problem was. They said, well, this is a carbon steel loop and we need to replace it with stainless. And they were willing to do that. But the NRC said, no, you can't do that. Because when you put in your application, you said that this was going to be carbon steel, and now you want to switch it to stainless steel. And they said, yeah, it's better. And they said, it's a change. You need to get a new license if you want to do that. What happened was, systematically, the anti-nukes imposed a hostile regulatory structure, which has increased the time it takes to build a nuclear power plant in the United States from 3 years to 16, more than 5 times. And
How long?
What? 16. And yes.
To 6 years?
16 years.
I thought you said that.
That's what I said.
Man.
From 3 years to 16,
Whoa.
multiplied 5 times. Where as this thing unfolded over time, and the time doubled and tripled and eventually quintupled, the cost to the plants went up as time squared. Okay, now you'd think it would just go up with time, since after all, cost is people times time. But the longer it takes, the more problems and lawsuits and so forth accrete to the project. And lawyers cost a lot more than plumbers. And they do. And so the cost of nuclear power has gone up about 25 times in the United States.
Wow.
Because of this regulatory sabotage. Now, in China and South Korea, it still takes 4 years to build a nuclear power plant. Okay. Now, by the way, the time should have gone down, not up. The time should have gone down, because as we became more familiar with nuclear power, it should have become easier to do. The German Green Party, which has shut down the entire German nuclear industry whole. And there's frankly good evidence to show that many of the individuals involved in making that decision at the highest political levels were directly on the Russian payroll. In fact, one of them is currently on the board of Gazprom. If you want to help nature, don't draw your resources from it. It is precisely because nuclear power is artificial rather than quote unquote natural. Because nuclear power draws on a resource that the biosphere does not draw from. And so you're being kind to nature by not looting it. To save the natural, use the artificial. Approved. There's a diagram in my book showing the 32-step process you have to go through to get a nuclear power plant approved. And it looks like the New York subway system. And actually, it's more complicated than that, because within each of those subway stops is a whole nother subway system. And for example, one of the subway stops is called the Environmental Protection Agency. And it will not only take forever to examine your permit, they will also require you to produce answers to questions like, prove to us that your decision to build a nuclear power plant was correct. Why not build something else? Imagine that the town says to you, you need to prove to us that building a log cabin was the correct decision. Why not an A-frame? Why not a chalet? Why not a Cape Cod? Why not a candy store? Why not a zoo?
It's a stupid question.
But now it's open to interveners to challenge the mayor's approval decision. And they can take the city to court for approving your log cabin. And now you have to prove in front of a judge and jury that the decision was valid. And you somehow do that. And then they appeal it to the higher court. And you got to do it all over again. This is how nuclear power is being regulated. Imagine if the system instead was, before you go on a road trip, you got to go to the police station and prove to the police that you're not going to speed. And not only that, prove to the police that you should go on a road trip instead of staying home. You can't go anywhere. And that's how this thing is being run. Sierra Club in the 60s had been pro-nuclear.
Right.
Because it doesn't produce all the smoke of the fossil fuels. But in 1974, they come out against nuclear power. And in their statement where they explain this, because before to their membership, they were pro-nuclear, they said, we have to be against nuclear power because it could encourage unnecessary economic growth. And then they said as well, and this is discussed in the book, Case for Nukes, how are we going to stop nuclear power? We're going to stop it by stopping them from disposing of their waste. This is not a technically difficult problem.
No, it's not.
It's like somebody saying parking cars is impossible because the city has passed a law against parking cars. The United States, we were getting orders for 2 new big nuclear power plants every month in the early 70s. If we had been allowed to continue that, we would have completely nuclearized and decarbonized our entire electric grid by 1990. France did so.
Yeah.
Okay. So really, right now, if not for the anti-nuclear movement, every advanced country would already be over 80% zero emission power nuclear.
Antarctica, you've heard a lot of news lately about Doomsday, the Doomsday Glacier, the Thwaites ice shelf and ice sheet. And I've run webcasts on why you should be careful about how you interpret the word collapse when you hear about the Doomsday Glacier, because it's a process that takes centuries. It's not like Florida's not going to go underwater anytime soon. But there hasn't been an energy transition. More than 80% of the world's primary energy, all the energy we use, is still fossil. And it was 30 or 40 years ago. And we're greatly increasing solar and wind and renewables, and nuclear has been this, sort of steady state and shrinking wedge. But all that stuff, it's like frosting on a carbon cake. And that carbon cake keeps getting bigger and bigger, especially because poor countries want to get richer. And if they have fossil fuels, who are we to tell a country with scant energy options that they no longer can do what we did for 100 years?
When you ask about, is there something negative associated with nuclear energy, the answer is yes. It's the end of civilization. So this is a serious thing to attach to nuclear energy. I have a record of a conversation among physicists saying, well, let's build nuclear reactors. Will the public have a problem accepting nuclear reactors, and replacing coal plants? And somebody says, well, it wasn't 10,000 tons of coal that they dropped on Hiroshima. So what are people going to do about it? Well, they're going to have an anti-war movement. The anti-nuclear movement decided quite deliberately that they would make the bomb tests their focus. Well, if you want to stop nuclear bomb tests, you adopt this no threshold hypothesis. Famously, the double Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling comes out and marching in the streets and tries to get arrested and so forth on the basis that 100 million people, given this tiny exposure, you're going to have tens of thousands of monster babies and cancers and so forth. On the other hand, the father of the atomic bomb, Edward Teller, adopts the other party. So he goes out and says, no, there's the threshold. In fact, maybe even a little bit of radioactivity is good for you. Well, Teller's the father of the atomic bomb. He's Dr. Strangelove. Linus Pauling is the great lovable old guy and so forth. So the whole anti-nuclear movement and a lot of scientists who are associated with the anti-nuclear bomb movement adopt this hypothesis. When you get large levels of fallout, then it is dangerous. So you can get heightened rates of leukemia when you get this. And the Atomic Energy Commission didn't want to admit this. They wanted to cover it up. And so, although it took a while for all this to come out, but people quite quickly smelled there was something wrong. So the idea of the unreliable authority, the one who will irradiate you for his own secret purposes, got associated, and rightly so, with the atomic energy establishment. The same thing with nuclear waste. It was all Cold War, it was all secret. You don't want the Russians to know about it, so they didn't say anything about the waste. Even when it was dangerous, they wouldn't admit it. They wouldn't say where the stuff was buried. And so there's a whole long legacy, just trust us attitude on the part of the nuclear authorities in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Let me just give you a brief riff because this is so connected to the need for doing something with nuclear reactors. And that is, just let me say something that most people don't understand about climate change. If you go into the fine print, which the IPCC doesn't like to emphasize, but you go down and look at it closely, you see there's a 5% chance that our current policies will blow it. We'll set off feedbacks and we'll get up to 5 degrees C or something, which is basically a temperature which would be impossible to sustain any kind of liberal and prosperous civilization. And as I found 2 different scientists saying the same thing, you don't get on an airplane that has a 5% chance of crashing. So that's what I want people to understand about our current situation.
In fact, you can store about 1.5 times more hydrogen in ammonia than you actually can when you liquefy hydrogen. The problem with ammonia is its flammability limit is very narrow. And interestingly enough, unlike when you burn anything in air, which is 78% nitrogen, you get nitrous oxide. Even hydrogen burned in air creates NOx. When you burn ammonia and oxygen, there's no NOx. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of talk of an experimentation with adding hydrogen to existing lines. And there's some research coming out to say this is a very dangerous thing to do because you will have hydrogen leakage no matter what you do, and you will have metal embrittlement. And the problem with adding hydrogen to a line when you get embrittlement is it doesn't fail at the ejection point. That hydrogen separates out all the way through that line. So when that line fails, it's catastrophic and the entire line is gone.
So if you have a coal plant, chances are, the DOE did research into this, that 80% in the United States can be converted to use nuclear heat to create electricity. The IAEA going for a tripling of the capacity in the world. I still regard that as a pretty low bar. If you look at the fundamental problems that come with the energy choices that we are making today, I think that we need a heck of a lot more. Is the issue when you figure in that you want to do, for instance, synthetic fuels, when you figure in that you need to do different ways of agriculture, when you figure in that you need to start moving more product on a world scale, because we will be 11 billion individuals by 2100. Simply that fact alone means that we need to start pushing around much more food than we are doing today. So, I just don't see it. I once did a calculation. If we would cut 50% of our primary energy demand and we would increase an energy efficiency of 30% on top of what we have today, and the people in the non-OECD, so they're 7 billion right now, and there are going to be 9 or 10 billion people by 2100. If these people then get up to the same level as we are with all the energy savings, all the energy efficiency, then primary energy demand is still going to rise. We are going to shoot up beyond 200,000 terawatt hours per year. Currently, we're at 170. So we are going up to 250, maybe even 300 terawatt hours per year. So with all due respect to all the people who think that tripling is ambitious, I'm very sorry. I hate to break it to you, but that's not ambitious. And even if we do all the renewables that we can build, even then it's not going to be enough. We will still be using gas, coal, and oil well up into the 2100s if we don't get serious about decarbonization, electricity, nuclear energy. It's all just going to be Sunday school stuff.
Germany was once the richest country in Europe, is now quickly becoming the sick man of Europe. Not only is 30% of the population which is energy impoverished, which means that they have to make decisions on a night like tonight whether to have air conditioning or lights. But you're also finding a lot of supply chain issues because a lot of the great German companies unable to meet demand because they at certain points have to either shut off their factories for energy reasons or move production elsewhere. They don't produce ammonia anymore in Germany, BASF, because it is too energy intensive. I don't think they think they're lying, but there are people obviously within organizations like Greenpeace who do know the facts, who do read the documents, but continue to prolong the lie. One of the rather interesting documents that I leaked earlier in the year was from the a group of German anti-GMO campaigners. And they basically said, look, we've been trying for 10 years on gene editing, on new plant breeding technologies. We don't have the science. We don't have the facts. We're losing. So what do we do? Now, the answer should be, well, you should just admit that you're mistaken and move on. But they had to come up with another type of campaign because they know the facts, but it's about winning. And so they have to find out how they can win. And they can't imagine people that they've been trained over decades to hate. They couldn't imagine them actually having or allowing gene edited seeds to be used in agriculture, regardless of the benefits. In fact, one of the main organizations that was involved in the leaked document, the leaked German document, Bioland, which is a German organic market chain. So there's an enormous amount of money being spent. And if you look at the types of studies that are being paid for to try to show that glyphosate somewhere causes some problem to someone or something, the money that's coming out of these foundations is quite generous. I wrote an article about 5 years ago called Why I Don't Publish in Peer-Reviewed Journals. Really, you could publish anything. I mean, the Sokoff affair from about 5-6 years ago showed that most articles aren't even read. And I think that they said a majority of articles published in the peer review system aren't even read, not even by the authors. So we're in a system right now where there's a lot of bias at the editorial level. You have a lot of people who are just publishing really poor quality, but the peer review process itself is one you just have to pay the $2,000 or so to go through the process, and they'll put it online for you. So there are some real troubles with the state of publishing. And unfortunately, that's also showing up with academic integrity then, because a lot of people who are caught up in political debates or working, for example, for tort law firms will publish things that can then be used by activist groups to then leverage the position in a particular debate.
Fukushima, it all started, say, in 1987. I work for a group, a company in Palo Alto, California, called the Nuclear Safety Analysis Center, NSAC. Director was David Rossen. David Rossen later became Assistant Secretary of Department of Energy. At that time, the Chernobyl happened. And I had a chance to participate in analyzing the Chernobyl accident. That subject I can talk about not 2 hours, but 2 days, every minute of it. But I will skip that. From analyzing Chernobyl, we learned what could be the disastrous situation for nuclear power plant at that time. We identified one. It's called tsunami-induced station blackout. If we had that, the nuclear power plant would be doomed. That's what 1987. Some utilities in Japan did not take it very seriously. Tokyo Electric Power did not take it very seriously. There's another example for me to say that. There's a new technology for called the PRA, probabilistic risk assessment. It tells your nuclear power plant is safe or not. If not, what do you do about it? If you put the equipment in, the safety level is going to be increased from 1.5 to 20.63. Okay, that's science. US invented that science. US Nuclear Regulatory Commission adopted science and made that a licensing basis 25 years ago, which is a great thing that happened. Tokyo Electric Power Company did not believe that. So when tsunami hit Fukushima, it was a standard station blackout. You wipe out the diesel generator, which is the station blackout lifesaver. Then the next level is the battery. Then the battery was exhausted, and everything that we predicted going to happen happened. But the Tohoku Electric Power Company that had another nuclear power plant very similar to Fukushima, and they believed it. The Onagawa nuclear power plant was completely safe. United States, that would never happen because the regulation, the procedure is rigorously followed. There's a new subject called the 1 million person study. Go Google this word. 7 or 8 years ago, United States came out with a new subject. They performed a study to find out if low dose radiation could do the health benefit. They could. The data says so. The 1 million person study, where the 1 million people come from, is come from the employee of Department of Energy, a national laboratory. NIH sponsored the radiation environment laboratories. The military personnel, 30, 40, 50 years ago, they watched, the atomic explosion, the test. They all experience radiation. They don't die. A lot of them, live very well. If you experience radiation level low enough to be in the health benefit range, you will live 20% longer. That's the statement. So I made a joke out of that. By the way, everybody had COVID vaccine 2 times. And when you were a little boy, you had a vaccine. Now I have taken every year the flu shot vaccine. Imagine 20 years, everybody line up to take extra rays. That's the new vaccine coming up to boost up your energy immune system.
So welcome to our show. Let's start off by asking you, what is geometallurgy?
It's a systems approach to integrate everything in geology with mineral processing and mining engineering. It's essentially systems thinking for mining.
You've done a detailed study of what's required to phase out fossil fuels in favor of renewables, and your assessment is pretty bad. So could you give us the rundown on that?
Assessment of the extra capacity required of alternative energy electrical power systems to completely replace fossil fuels. The point of debate at the moment is how big should the buffer storage be for stationary power storage for wind and solar? Now, current thinking thinks we need, say, 5 to 7 hours. I'm saying 28 days, but even that is far, far, far undershooting what's actually needed. So these numbers are conservative. Sum it all together by metal. For the 28-day buffer assumption, in with everything else, we need 4.7 billion tons of copper. So say that again, 4.7 billion tons with copper. Now, the mining industry is producing 24 million a year. So that's in 2019 rates of mining production. So if we were to run the mining industry as it is now, which is having trouble, meeting demand, we would have to consume 195 years of production just to hit that target of 4.7 billion. Now, remember, that is to replace the first generation of stuff we've got around us now. Cars wear out, turbines wear out. After about 20 years, you've got to take them all down and decommission them and replace them, which means we need to source another 4.7 billion tons again, 20 years later. Now, from 2020 back to 4000 BC, as in all historically in our history, the human race mined 700 million tons of copper.
Wow.
For the Green Revolution, we need 4.7 billion tons. That is 6.7 times the entire historical quantity the human race mined over the last 4,000 years. We're not actually doing the math or the practicality of whether something can be done, and everything is seen as an economic action, whereas if the demand is there, the outcome will magically physically appear. So let's go through a couple of these. Let's go through three: copper, lithium, and nickel. So to sum it all together and what we need 976 million tons of lithium. So global mining production was 95,000 tons. So if we were to hit that target with the mining industry the way it is at the moment, like without expansion at all, we would need to operate for 10,258 years to produce that volume of metal. The reserves in the ground that we know of, this is in 2022, as stated by the US Geological Survey, account for 2.25% of the volume of metal we would need to replace the first generation of stuff that you have around you now. All battery metals, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and vanadium, are all under 5%. Elon Musk came out and said we don't need to use lithium to make batteries. And that is an amazing innovation. To do it, he is making batteries out of a variation of NMC 532, which is a chemistry that needs nickel, manganese, and cobalt. So let's look at nickel. Nickel and cobalt have problems. So nickel, we need 970.8 million tons of nickel. Mining production of nickel was 2.3 million tons in the year 2019. So we would have to work for 413 years of the mining industry capacity as it is now to hit that target. And nickel reserves is less than 10% of what we need if we were to access it. The problem is these numbers are so large, we're not going to be able to do it in time. We're going to bring on 70 million new vehicles a year, each year for the next 20 years, and then we can replace it in 20 years. So here is the actual metal produced in 2019. That's that column there. Go down to rare earths down the bottom. So neodymium, which is what we need to make in magnets, we need 40 years of production for that. Solid state batteries, for example, require lots of germanium in it. Now, we want 4.1 million tons, but we're producing 143 tons a year at the moment. So that's 29,000 years of production. So the guys who come up with this sort of stuff, great, it's great science and everything like that, but when you want us to scale it up, that's when the trouble starts. And it takes like 15 to 20 years to develop a mine. So this is a solar radiance for Germany in the year 2015. So solar radiance doesn't mean power production, but it's the source of it. Like this is the amount of solar radiance you've got available. So you would actually pick the halfway mark. This is our base load. Anything over that dotted line will be excess and needs to be stored. So this is across our summer. And anything under that dotted line is actually where we need excess released. So that's our buffer, the gray. So the power buffer would need to collect excess power over 6 months, store it for about 6 to 7 months, and release it slowly over the 6 months after that. So that is 28 days, that red square, and that's one reference. That's 48 hours. The base of the food chain on land in the ocean is now collapsing. Right, insect populations, small birds, plankton in the sea. The ecological implications are not good for the long-term sustainability of large mammals like us. And by 2050, there'll be more plastic in the oceans than they'll outweigh the fish.
Wow.
Population sizes of mammals, birds, fish, and amphibians and reptiles have seen an average drop of 68% since 1970. Only 2% of the large fish remain on the planet in the mid-2000s compared to the 1960s. Pesticides' effects on insect populations are enormous, Roundup in particular. 40% of all insect species are declining globally. Declining bee populations pose a threat to global food security. Beekeepers in the United States reported losing 45.5% of their managed honeybee colonies from April 2020 to April 2021. Biological indicators for vertebrates to imply population annihilation and the sixth mass extinction. 70% of bird mass is domestic birds. and 30% is the other 11,000 species. Consider, if you will, how it will look in 50 years.
Yeah.
We are harvesting all the systems beyond their ability to repair themselves. If we harvested like much, much less volume, the planet could be sustainable. But because we're chewing through those systems so quickly, we're chewing through the legacy stuff that's needed to produce the next generation. We're not going to be able to generate enough power fast enough to replace fossil fuels. The black line at the top is the amount of electrical power we will need to supply to society on an annual basis to replace fossil fuels. Blue columns are the expansion of power delivered by the nuclear industry if they would expand by 25 new reactors each and every year from 2025 onwards. And we get out to the year 2101, 75 years later, and existing resources and reserves all the way out to unconventional are consumed, and we're only 60% of the way there. So the existing nuclear power plant fleet cannot help us. But if we were to evolve it to one of the subcategories called thorium molten salt,
yes,
we might get somewhere. Now, recycling. There's a lot of useful technology in recycling, and the problem is getting a consistent volume to it that actually makes it viable. Now you've got the discussion of how much energy is put in. Like, at what point is it not worth recycling something? And one of them is we reimagine every single sector, and how I see recycling being reimagined. Imagine all those ICE cars, internal combustion cars. They're full of things like bearings and axles and alternators and batteries and radiators. And right, I can see a situation where each of those cars are rounded up and they're pulled apart, and all the valuable bits are actually kept in a shed. This is like a conventional auto wreckers. And then the bits that are left over, right, that we can't really do anything with, that's what goes into recycling. My work was to map how the system was in 2018. By 2062, we're going to go from 7 billion out to something like 10.4 billion. The problem is, to replace what we have around us now that's dependent on fossil fuels, we don't have enough minerals in the ground as it is now. If we were to expand to the point where everyone on the planet had the same level of development, like all the poorer nations came into alignment with, say, Europe, Germany in Europe, that would be more again. And oil in particular, we don't have enough oil for that, because we want to replace the most dense energy system the world has ever known. And we're going to replace it with a very expensive and less effective energy system.
I think either 10 or 20 years, I forget, they were saying that mining from space will be a multi-billion-dollar industry.
The idea of going up into space and mining, I think, is feasible in a very, very small application at the moment, but to develop our technology at the moment to the point where we can scale it up, that requires an industry base that I think, back on Earth, that I think is going to struggle, because it's a volume thing. You might be able to produce a small amount of volumes, but how do you get it back onto the planet to be useful for everyone else?
Did you hear about the bet? For our audiences, what happened is that Ehrlich just said everything's going into crap because, we're just going to run out of everything. And Simon said, no, you're going to be able to innovate our way out of it. And Simon was right.
So Simons did indeed win the bet. But if they had the same bet 10 years later, Ehrlich would have won the bet. If they were to have the same bet now, and you'll probably find the decade they had the bet in was the only time Simons could have won, and every time since then he would have lost.
The part of the grid that is going to be in trouble is what they call the deregulated grid. The first thing that is likely to happen, and it's already happened in California, it is likely to happen in the Northeast, is basically that there will not be enough electricity to go around during extreme weather. And during extreme weather, there will be rolling blackouts. People are putting a lot of renewables on the grid. And then when the renewables on the grid, they say, oh, well, the renewables go on and off rather quickly. So let's see if we can back them up with natural gas. Well, the thing about natural gas is you can only get as much as is available in the pipeline. You can't store it on site. Some power plants have LNG on site, but not regular pipeline natural gas. And so in a bad weather situation, or if there's a compressor going out on a gas pipeline or whatever, you won't be able to get natural gas. Now, some of the RTOs say, well, yeah, but we have a three-link stool here. We have the renewables, the natural gas backup, and we can get energy from our neighbors. Well, the thing is, if you're talking about any kind of emergency, like a really bad cold snap, a really bad heat wave, or a really major compressor outage on a pipeline, the neighbors are probably in trouble too, and they're not going to be able to send you any electricity. So basically, the beginning would be rolling blackout.
Basically, what it is a challenge to prevailing what we call vertical knowledge, which is the thing that everybody knows that happens to be wrong. And the thing that everybody knows that happens to be wrong is that the global population is exploding. The UN, at the time we were writing the book, was telling us that we're going to reach 11.2 billion people by the end of the century. How are we possibly going to sustain the Earth, and how are we possibly going to sustain humanity? The thing that's wrong is that that's going to happen. It's not going to happen. The population is probably going to peak somewhere between 8 and 9 billion sometime mid-century, and start to decline after that. And the real challenge is not going to be a population explosion. It's going to be a population implosion. In 100 years, if we all start to stop reproducing, and that's basically what's happening right now, is we're stopping reproduction, humanity doesn't exist. Just to hold the population steady, we need to have a birth rate in developing countries of about 2.1. The United States, it was 1.6. Canada today, it's 1.4. Between India and China, the two largest countries in the world, that's 36% of the global population. They're not having replacement birth rates. You go to Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, most of those countries are below replacement rate. You go to Europe, many countries in Europe are already in population decline. Italy loses 165,000 people from its population every year. Japan loses 650,000 people from its population every year. The only place that has really consistent population replacement rate now is Africa, but it's coming down quite dramatically as well. So this is a global phenomena. It's happening in every single country. There's no country that's actually adding to its fertility rate. In other words, the number of kids they're having is actually expanding. Back in 1960, 2/3 of the global population lived in rural areas. Today, almost 60% of the global population lives in urban areas. When you move from the country to the city, the way that you look about the size of your family changes. In the countryside, these are useful assets on the farm. Lots of kids, lots of useful production on the farm. When you move to the city, they're merely expensive. So that's one element. But the really big reason is the lives of women change. And they start making different decisions about their lives. And if they get married at all, they want to get married later. And if they want to start a family at all, they want to start their family later. When you look at the data and you look at what's most highly correlated to declining fertility levels, it's actually the increasing educational levels of women. Given the speed at which all of this is happening, it's actually becoming a bad thing. What's happening with this issue of population, you can mark it on the calendar. 2030, the entire global baby boom is going to be 65 years of age or older. 2050, we're all going to start dying. So we've got a population, this bulge in the population that's aging. You don't age well. Most of the money that you spend on healthcare, pensions, social services, and everything happens in that latter part of your life. Going to be very, very difficult for a younger, shrinking population to pay for all of that.
So I hope you have enjoyed our show today. David Bricker was the last speaker, and we will always produce children. Children are wonderful. Dr. Bricker makes one important point in the end that was left out, is that the good side of it is that the reduction of human population will be the solution to all the ecological problems that we have created. So I see a very good future. If you want to join us next week, we could talk about that. And you could join us on Soyatel TV and put in questions. And also we'll be in the Ecomodernist channel, of course. And we will have a redux of the best of 2023. So anyhow, I would like to end by again wishing you all a happy new year and hope for the best. And remember, missions first, peace and justice will follow. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.